life of victory simply by the power of the resurrection. As we prepare for 2013, what kind of year do you want it to be? You can help determine how that is. And you say, well, wait a minute, I can't tell God. No, of course you can. God's in charge of everything, of your circumstances. But whether you have a victorious year, that's already God's will. So therefore, it's in your court. If you're not having victory, it's not God's fault. And it's not that God doesn't want it. He wants victory, and he wants breakthrough. That's the will of God. The key is what we go with. You know, if you have a ladder and it's missing the first few steps, you're not going anywhere. You know, if you have a staircase and it's missing the first step or steps, you're not going anywhere either. And so the key is what can make or break your walk, and what can change your walk is the key of the first step. Without the first step, nothing happens. Messiah spoke of investing. He said, where you put back, you invest, you're sowing to the Lord, or he talked about the talents and all that. Well, the key here is where you put things in your life, whatever you do, you're investing. And so if you let's speak for a moment financially. If you could invest in something that gives you 5% return, that's a real big thing right now. That would be one thing. But if you could invest in something that gave you 50% return rather, that would be so much more. If you could invest something that gives you 1,000% return, that would be amazing. Well, the key here is the first step is like that 1,000%. Where you invest your time, you invest in the first step, and I'll explain what this means, and you'll get the most out of where you're going. In Mark 1, verse 14 to 20, Messiah calls the apostles. He calls Peter. Peter sees them. It says they dropped their nets. He drops his net, and he walks and begins to follow Messiah. Now, Peter was going to do all sorts of things in his life. He was going to walk on water. He's going to lead the church in many ways. He's going to do so many things. But he could do none of those things if he didn't take that first step that day. And that first step that day was a hard step, because to do that step, he was changing everything in his life. Everything before, the first step, here's one of the principles, is the hardest step, yet it's the most powerful step. Simon Peter would do a lot of things, but none of it would happen without that first step when he walked away from his net. Moses, Exodus 3, 1 through 5, Moses was called to do great things. And look at all that he did. The man who stood up to Pharaoh, who crossed the Red Sea, who gave the law, the Ten Commandments, led the people 40 years in the wilderness, so much. But all that was hanging on his first step. When God sees him, when he sees God, or he sees the sign in the wilderness, and God says, take off your shoes, Moses. Take it off. And you're standing on holy ground. So Moses takes off his shoes, and then he just stands there with God. That was his first step. If he didn't do that, none of the rest would happen. Forget about Moses. We wouldn't even know his name. And you look, if God said to him, listen, this is what you're going to do. You're going to do this. You're going to take them out of Egypt. You're going to take them to the Red Sea. They're going to moan and complain against you, but you're going to lift up your staff, and all that's going to happen is going to open up, and you're going to lead them to the wilderness, but they're going to come against you, but you're going to go to Mount Sinai. You're going to bring the law, the Ten Commandments. You're going to bring the tabernacle. You're going to go for 40 years leading them. Moses was 80 years old when he heard all this. He probably said, I can't. I'm an old man. This is my retirement here. But God didn't tell him all that. I mean, he told him a little bit, but God gives him the first step. Moses, take off your shoes. After that, it says, go down to Pharaoh. But he says, take off your shoes. You cannot, if you look at all that's ahead of you and all the things you need to do, it can be overwhelming. It can be paralyzing. But God doesn't do that. He says, just focus on this one step here. Focus on this one step here, and you will get everywhere you need to go. But it all starts with that first decision, that first action in that new direction. If you look at the great lives in the Bible, you see this pattern again and again. Abraham, the father of the faithful, all that he did, all that happened through Abraham, the spiritual father of believers, the physical father of the Jewish people. and of the Arab peoples. It all began when God said, come, leave. And Abraham took his first step. That first step was the hardest because he was an Ur of Chaldea. He was a Babylonian. And the biggest step was that one step. But once he did, everything else happened. It opened the door for everything else. Esther was queen of Persia, and yet we would probably have never heard of her if she didn't take that step that Mordecai told her to do. When she says, if I perish, I perish. This was her first step of truly following God, a step of total newness, unlike the steps before. Paul on the road to Damascus. He's told, you think of all the things that he's going to do. All the things, Paul is going to change the Roman Empire, going to change the world, is going to do so much. But it all began with that first step. He is blinded, and God says, rise up and go. And that he takes his first step on that, and that he takes that first step, rise up, go. And that he will become the Apostle Paul. He will become the one who changes the world. But if he didn't take that step, it wouldn't happen. He's going to do all these things, but it all hangs on the first moment, the first action, the first response. Now, if you look at that,